Order, please. The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, pursuant to the notice of motion given by me on June the 30th, 2006, and the rules and forms of procedure of the House of Assembly, I have the honour by command to present a message from Her Honour the Lieutenant Governor of the Province of Nova Scotia, relating to the estimates of sums required for the service of the province for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2007, which is, I hereby transmit estimates of sums required for the public service of the province for the year ending March 31st, 2007, and in accordance with the Constitution Act 1867, recommend them, together with the budget address of my Minister of Finance, and any resolutions or bills necessary or advisable to approve the estimates and implement the budget measures to the House of Assembly. And it's signed, Myra A. Freeman, Lieutenant Governor. Mr. Speaker, at this time, I wish to table the estimates from Her Honour the Lieutenant Governor, transmitting the estimates for consideration of this House. Table the estimate books. Table the consolidated fiscal plan for the government, consisting of the government business plans and other information contained in the budget. Table the Crown Corporation business plans. Table the estimate and Crown Corporation business plans resolutions. Deliver my budget speech, and move that the estimates of sums required for the service of the province for the fiscal year ending March 31st, 2007, being supplied to be granted to Her Majesty, and the Crown Corporation business plans be referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Supply. Mr. Speaker, before I begin the budget address proper, I have a number of introductions that I'd like to make of visitors to your gallery. First of all, in the Speaker's gallery opposite is Minister Bev Harrison, who is the Minister of Supply and Services for the province of New Brunswick, and also the Government House Leader there, and a former Speaker of that province for many years. I'd like Mr. Harrison to rise and receive the greetings of the House. Sitting opposite or next to Mr. Harrison, someone else many members of the House would know is my wife Cindy, who is here to join us today and watch me do it all over again, as they say. My boys, unfortunately, it's summer in Nova Scotia. And most importantly, sailing season in Lunenburg County. In the gallery opposite, Mr. Speaker, I also have a number of other visitors that I'd like to acknowledge. That is my mother and father, Gilbert and Barbara Baker. And my sister Valerie, her husband Paul Burley, and my nephew Joshua Burley, who are very conveniently, the timing of the host this summer has been very convenient for them as they're visiting Nova Scotia from Ontario. Also in the gallery opposite, we have Mr. Richie Cotton, President of the Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities. And last but by no means least, I'd like to take the moment to opportunity to acknowledge the staff of the Department of Finance and Treasury and Policy Board who are with us today. They have been very busy, not only with the original budget that I introduced, but with respect to the updated budget that I'm presenting today. And I'd like them to rise and receive the acknowledgement of the House. Mr. Speaker, I am pleased to rise and to provide members with an update of the 2006-2007 budget address. Members will be pleased to know that as budget speeches go, my remarks today will be relatively brief, and for good reason. The budget I am tabling today includes the exact same spending commitments with the exact same timelines as the one I tabled on May the 9th. It was a good budget for Nova Scotians then, and it is a good budget now. It's good for seniors and students, it's good for families and taxpayers, and it's good for our economy. An economy that continues to create quality, full-time jobs and generate new revenues. Revenues that we are reinvesting in programs, services, and targeted initiatives that will enhance Nova Scotia's economic growth and social progress. I say this with confidence, Mr. Speaker, knowing that, to a large extent, the new investments outlined in our budget are supported by Nova Scotians from every region and every walk of life. Nova Scotians who gathered in church basements, Legion halls, schools, and community centres to advise us on how we could strengthen our economy and more appropriately respond to the needs of our seniors and our students. And we listened. And we responded with a budget that does just that. Mr. Speaker, I am not going to reiterate all of the items referenced in my earlier budget address. I do, however, especially for the benefit of new members of the House, want to put things into context and briefly speak to the highlights of our budget. First and foremost, it is balanced.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, that's right. You're loud. In fact, it is Nova Scotia's 5th consecutive balanced budget, an achievement that has eluded many other provinces. It is a budget that projects a healthy surplus of $73.5 million that will go directly to the debt. This will further bring down our net direct debt to GDP ratio, which has already dropped by more than 10 percentage points within the past 6 years, from 48.7% in 1999-2000 to 37.9% this year. Clear progress and a clear signal to Nova Scotians and to our creditors that as each year passes, we continue to put our fiscal house in better order. And, Mr. Speaker, it is a budget that continues to create a climate of greater confidence in our economy by lowering business taxes and eliminating regulation that stifles business growth, taking a more focused and proactive approach to skills and trades training, investing more dollars to promote tourism and to further support our growing arts and culture sector. And providing significant dollars to fix our roads and bridges, to make our highways safer, and to build, renovate, and we will build, renovate, or modernize our schools and our hospitals. It is a budget that will help tens of thousands of Nova Scotians better cope with the costs and the pressures of day-to-day life. It rebates the provincial portion of the HST on home energy costs and raises the basic personal exemption so all Nova Scotians pay less tax and thousands pay no tax at all. It increases funding to create more affordable housing units, to help income assistance recipients pay for their housing costs, and to help seniors and low-income Nova Scotians with emergency repairs to their homes. It ensures that the $1,200 federal child care benefit helps young parents and their children to the full extent. And it kickstarts our commitment to create 1,500 child care spaces. We will be providing ongoing additional funding of $4.7 million a year to child care in Nova Scotia. That is part of a 10-year child care strategy. As well, beginning on October 1st of this year, our budget will provide as many as 33,000 children from families of modest means with the medicine they need to get better at home. Our Children's Pharmacare program will not only reduce the emotional stress and financial pressure on thousands of Nova Scotian parents, it will provide the added benefit of reducing unnecessary and costly emergency room visits. And next year, we will complement our Children's Pharmacare plan with the introduction of Atlantic Canada's first Working Families Pharmacare plan. We will do this believing that no Nova Scotian, young or old, should be denied the prescription drug coverage most of us have come to rely on. Mr. Speaker, our budget not only contributes to a more vibrant economy and provides assistance to individuals and families in need, it provides significant new resources to help our children learn better and to live better. It commits an additional $20.2 million to implement the next steps in our Learning for Life 2 plan. In addition, it sets new dollars to support both students who excel and those who are at risk by introducing the International Baccalaureate and Opportunities and Options programs into more schools. These new investments, along with increased funding to implement the recommendation of the HOG and Black Learners Advisory Committee reports, demonstrates our commitment to help all our children succeed in school and in life. Mr. Speaker, we also want all our children to grow up healthy and to stay healthy. That is why we are more than tripling our Healthy Living tax credit, hiring more physical education teachers, increasing the funding for teen health centers, and stepping up our efforts to make our children more aware of the consequences of smoking, alcohol and drug abuse, and risky sexual behavior. Mr. Speaker, our budget also recognizes the need to help our post-secondary students better manage and cope with the cost of their investment in a quality education. That is why our budget introduces Nova Scotia's first graduate tax credit, doubles existing employment and repayment bonuses, reduces parental contribution requirements for Nova Scotia student loan eligibility, and adjusts loan repayment amounts to more affordable levels. We know the value of a post-secondary education. We know that the costs are too high. We know that we have a responsibility to young Nova Scotians and their parents and to the future prosperity of our province to do everything we can reasonably do to make a university or college education more affordable for our students. Mr. Speaker, beyond the need to support young Nova Scotians in getting the education they need and deserve, is the need to provide older Nova Scotians with the care and support they deserve and need. And what seniors have told us they want and need most is the assurance that they can live as independently as possible for as long as possible in the comfort of their own homes. That is why our budget commits an additional $16 million this year to implement Nova Scotia's first continuing care strategy. a 10-year plan that will expand home support services, add more restorative beds, expand the number of adult day centers, and create 1,300 new long-term care beds. Mr. Speaker, members will note that every spending commitment made on May the 9th is being made again today. Members will also note that along with the original budget documents tabled before the House dissolved, I have tabled a budget addendum. Simply put, it is provided to give members and all Nova Scotians the latest and the most precise information on the minor changes that have occurred to our economic assumptions and revenue and expenditure projections since the budget was first tabled. In fact, when all the most recent economic forecasts and revenue and expenditure projections are factored in, we are projecting a small gain on the positive side of the ledger of $1.6 million. Again, Mr. Speaker, every cent of this added surplus will be applied to our debt. Mr. Speaker, I want to briefly mention an issue that members have been hearing a lot about in recent days, namely equalization. As members know, equalization is an extremely complicated formula that the Government of Canada uses to redistribute federal tax dollars among provinces. But equalization is a lot more than just a complicated formula. It is the federal government's constitutional commitment to you and me, every Nova Scotian and every Canadian, that says we are entitled to receive reasonably comparable levels of service at reasonably comparable levels of taxation. Clearly, this has not been the case. And clearly, the federal government and all the provinces and territories face a very difficult challenge in reaching consensus on what is a highly contentious and extremely important issue. As a government, we expect and will insist that any changes to the equalization formula be fairly applied and that they do not create an even greater fiscal imbalance between and among the provinces, and that they honor Ottawa's constitutional obligations to Nova Scotians. Beyond addressing equalization, the Government of Canada has the added obligation to address the broader issue of fiscal imbalance between the federal and provincial governments. An imbalance the new federal government has acknowledged exists and has promised to fix. To this end, Nova Scotia will be calling on Ottawa to provide adequate, predictable, and long-term transfers, and to recognize that the provinces have differing fiscal capacities and different expenditure needs. Mr. Speaker, in putting our budget together, we made the best possible decisions, based on the best information and in the best interests of all Nova Scotians. Our budget takes steps to ensure Nova Scotia continues to create quality, full-time jobs in every region of our province. It will relieve the financial pressures and emotional stress facing many Nova Scotians struggling to heat their homes, to raise their children, or to care for an aging parent. And it positively responds to the issues that are of most concern to most Nova Scotians. Timely access to health care, clean air and water, a first-class education for our children, better roads, and safer communities. It was a good budget for Nova Scotians on May 9th, and it still is today. Thank you very much.
The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is my privilege to rise again to begin the debate and reply to the budget on behalf of the official opposition. When I rose on May 9th for the same purpose, Mr. Speaker, I noted that the path between the budget as introduced and the budget as passed included an election. Mr. Speaker, so today we have essentially the same budget, but in a new context. There has been an election, the voters of Nova Scotia have spoken, and in our decision about what to do on this budget, we have to take into account the verdict that they have rendered on all of us. Mr. Speaker, on behalf of my party, I said on May 9th that it would be very difficult for this party to vote against a budget that included a measure as important and as necessary and as fair as removing the provincial portion of the HST from all sources of home heating. This is an important measure that the Leader of the Opposition and all of us in the NDP have advocated for a number of years, even when the members on the government side of the House said it was impossible, said it could not be done, Mr. Speaker. Over and over and over again, the former Premier, the former Minister of Finance said impossible, could not be done. And a few weeks before the election, Mr. Speaker, the government says, oh, indeed it can be done and it will be done. Mr. Speaker, and I want to pay tribute to the Leader of the Opposition for his perseverance in the face of the relentless negativity from the other side when they said, as he has shown on so many other issues, it doesn't matter how often that the people on that side of the House say, no, it can't be done. He will push on until it is done. It could be done. It always could be done. And we are pleased to see that in the budget reintroduced today that it will be done. And that is why, Mr. Speaker, that it's going to be very difficult for us to vote against this budget. We are going to do our jobs as the opposition. We are going to go through the estimates debate. This is nearly a $7 billion budget now, Mr. Speaker. We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to the people we represent to look at the budget very carefully. But, Mr. Speaker, unless there's something in the budget that we don't expect to find, some hidden measure that only comes to light in the estimates debate, then we believe it will be very difficult for us to vote against this budget. Of course, Mr. Speaker, we have to be mindful of the election result. Mr. Speaker, we have to be mindful of the fact that in modern times there is only one time per year in this House that the government faces a confidence motion, and that is on the budget. Now, since this is the first budget since the election, if the budget went down, then I expect that the Lieutenant Governor would be compelled to offer the opportunity to the leaders of the other parties to form a government, Mr. Speaker. But let's be clear, that's not what the people of Nova Scotia voted for, Mr. Speaker. More people voted for the Conservative Party. There are more members on the Conservative side of the House. And, Mr. Speaker, we understand that verdict and we respect that verdict, Mr. Speaker. Nobody wants that kind of instability. Nobody wants to show a disrespect to the voters' verdict. And that is another reason, Mr. Speaker, why, in all likelihood, it is the right thing for Nova Scotia this budget will pass. But let nobody be under any illusion that this is a budget that we would like to have seen, that this is a budget that we would have devised ourselves. Even though, Mr. Speaker, we are very pleased that the government has adopted our policy, our long-standing policy of taking the HST off home heating fuel. We believe it should be done as of November 1st, 2006. And not only can it be done, but it should be done. There is enough money in the surplus to bring it into effect when Nova Scotians need it at the beginning of the cold weather season, not when the government is simply willing to offer it, which is not until January 1st, 2007, Mr. Speaker. There is enough money to keep the best features of the Keep the Heat program. We have to take frank account of the fact, Mr. Speaker, that this version of delivering, this method of delivering tax relief to people paying for home heating will work to the disadvantage of those at the lowest end of the income scale. And the government should be under no illusion that our advocacy for this policy included the entire elimination of the best features of the Keep the Heat program. So, Mr. Speaker, it is not possible for the opposition parties, even voting together, to amend the budget against the will of the government. That's a matter of confidence on which the government could fall. But we say in all earnestness to the government, those are two things that you can do and you should do. You should consider amending your budget to bring it into effect at the beginning of the cold weather season on November 1st. It can be done. It should be done, Mr. Speaker. This government should consider keeping the best features of the Keep the Heat program, Mr. Speaker. It can be done, and it should be done. Mr. Speaker, there are other things in this budget that are not what we would have done. I don't know if members recall how disappointed representatives of student organizations were after the May 9th budget. They saw very little in this budget for them. And since the budget is essentially unchanged, students and student organizations and students' families will continue to be disappointed by the little or no support that this government offers to recognize the fact that this province has the highest post-secondary tuitions in Canada. We believe the government can move faster on long-term care beds and should move faster. It is unfortunate that the government has pushed out their long-term care plan over 10 years, far beyond the horizon of the next election and even the election after that, saying sometime vaguely in the future we're going to get to it sometime. More can be done, more should be done, Mr. Speaker, and my new colleague, the member for Shelburne, spoke eloquently about this last week. 30 years of promises in Western Shelburne County for more long-term care beds, and they still haven't come to fruition, Mr. Speaker. The government's 10-year plan is not good enough. The government can do better and should do better. One of the things that I heard, and I'm sure all the members in the House heard as we went around during the election campaign, was the desperate need to address waiting times in the healthcare system. And there is very little in the budget that directly deals with that very, very significant problem. So, Mr. Speaker, even though this is not the budget we would have introduced, even though we don't think it deals with key elements of the better deal for Nova Scotians that we talked about during the last election, we are very pleased with this important and historic measure of taking the HST off home heating fuel, something on which there should have been no provincial tax in the first place. We are mindful of the fact that by giving the government our support for this budget, that means that any opportunity to end this government now belongs to the government. Once this budget is passed and the government passes its first test of confidence, it is the government that will decide when the next election will be, either by calling the election themselves or by taking measures or taking steps or through their actions and inactions making it impossible for the members on this side of the House to continue to support them in the budget. So the responsibility for what happens from here on rests squarely with the members on that side of the House. There are some troubling signs, Mr. Speaker. We will hold the government accountable for what it has done. The government has still not come entirely clean on what happened last year in the economic development portfolio. It refused to answer the questions and arrogated to itself the power to decide what documents would be released to a committee of this legislature, Mr. Speaker. That can't be right. It is somewhat troubling to see the government's newfound emphasis on the equalization formula, because what I interpret that as being, Mr. Speaker, is the provincial government looking for somebody to point the finger at, somebody to blame, Mr. Speaker. In this new environment, they want to be able to say it's the federal government's fault, which is somehow ironic considering that they're all members of the same party. clearly we support the government's efforts to get a better equalization deal for Nova Scotia. But clearly as well, Mr. Speaker, we understand that it is not likely that that is going to come about without a great deal of time and effort on behalf of all the provinces, because let's be frank, the large provinces, the better off provinces, are completely against our getting a better deal. Ontario, British Columbia, Alberta are opposed to what our government wants. So because of that fact, it is somewhat disconcerting for us to see in the budget address today such an emphasis on blaming the federal government. It seems like the provincial government, is setting up the federal government as the party to be blamed if things don't go the way that they want. During the election, this government made promises that are going to be very difficult for them to keep. It is also disconcerting, Mr. Speaker, to see in the budget address today discussion of topics that aren't even in the budget. Again, a tendency, I think, of this new government, Mr. Speaker, to talk about things that they may do sometime in the future. I think we were all taken aback during the election when the Premier was talking about the pharmacare program, the new universal pharmacare program, that he had a great deal of difficulty explaining even the most basic details. Like what kind of copay would there be? What kind of premium, if any, would there be? When would it come into effect even, Mr. Speaker? If it's going to be in next year's budget, which we don't know for sure, Mr. Speaker, is it going to come into effect for April 1st with the new fiscal year? Or is the government again going to push it off into the future, January 1st, 2008, or even later? Because let's make no mistake about it, Mr. Speaker, every single member of the House supports the concept. But as we have seen with the Seniors Pharmacare program, there are few programs in the provincial budget that take up as much money and that grow as fast as pharmacare. So if we institute this program sometime in the future, how is the government going to be proposing to pay for it when the Seniors Pharmacare program has shown double-digit growth every year for the past many years, growing far in excess of provincial revenues? There may be answers, Mr. Speaker, but it is disconcerting to see the government having no answers and yet spending time in this year's budget address talking about something that's not even going to happen this year at all. It's almost as if there's an attempt to deflect attention from what's going on in this year's budget by getting people to think about what's going to happen sometime in the future. So as I say, Mr. Speaker, passing the budget means this government determines how long it will pass, how long it will last. The responsibility is in their hands. The responsibility is in their hands to listen to people on all sides of the House, to people on their side, to people in the NDP, people in the Liberal Party, not to pick and choose one or the other and say we're going to listen to those ideas but not those ideas, Mr. Speaker. Their responsibility is to do what's right for Nova Scotians. We know that. That is why we've been entirely consistent. We said in the spring that it was likely we would support the budget, and we say again now it is likely we're going to support the budget. It is, Mr. Speaker, a little surprising. I expect that after I sit down, the Liberal finance critic will get up and announce that, contrary to what they said in May, that they intend also to probably support this budget, Mr. Speaker. It's difficult for me to see, difficult for us to understand how a party could be opposed to a budget in May, and then when the very same budget is introduced later in the year, Mr. Speaker, that they, on the same budget, they will vote the opposite way. And Mr. Speaker, speaking of inconsistencies, I think that Nova Scotians were able to see what happens when you have a Conservative Party that largely adopts NDP policy. The only party that has been consistent throughout, Mr. Speaker, has been the NDP, Mr. Speaker. And I think, Mr. Speaker, that may be one of the reasons why more New Democrats were sent to this House. Hear, hear. Mr. Speaker, we have been consistent throughout, our leader has been consistent throughout, focused entirely on what is best for the people of Nova Scotia. Yeah. That will continue to be our standard, Mr. Speaker, now and in the future. Thank you.
The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It gives me pleasure today to rise and provide a reply to the budget address that we received today. And on behalf of the Liberal Caucus, I would like to express our pleasure that the Minister of Finance is here himself to deliver the new address today. Thank you very much. It is worth noting that the budget before us today is the same as it was 2 months ago, that there has been an election, that the context of our debate will be different as a result of that. And I think it's important that all members of the legislature be cognizant of the voice of the people when we've had an election, when there's been a return to government, of a minority government again, and much the same situation as we experienced prior to this last election call. Again, I think the people have spoken, and we have to respect that, and we have to work as much as we can together as colleagues to see that the government functions and functions to the best interest of the people of Nova Scotia. And that's important to all of us. In replying to the budget today, there's a few cautionary concerns that I have, and I would like to raise on behalf of our caucus as well. In the context of this budget, we now have a budget that is approaching $7 billion, and I think it's worth noting for all Nova Scotians that this budget was only around $5 billion 7 years ago in 1999. So Nova Scotians have seen an increase largely in their own source revenues, although last year we had more from the federal government. But a lot of our own source revenues have increased, and we're very fortunate that that's been the case. The economy's been strong not only here, but in other parts of Canada, and we have benefited from that. And we're all happy to see greater employment, more people in our own communities working and able to have good lives here in Nova Scotia. So it is a good thing. But having that extra money in our hands here in the government to spend wisely means that there should be improvements that Nova Scotians can feel and that they can recognize that times are better. A lot of the measures in this budget, as in previous ones, don't necessarily advance our cause dramatically. And I think that healthcare is a primary area to look at, that we have been muddling along, trying to improve healthcare, spending a tremendous amount of money every year, additional monies year after year. And again, it's worth noting that in 1999, the Tory leader at that time said that healthcare could be fixed for $46 million. Well, today, Mr. Speaker, we're spending $1.4 billion more in that system, or a total of $1.4 billion, and it's still not enough. And I think that 7% increase this year is tremendous. Last year it was double-digit increases, and we still have the same concerns about wait lists and the lack of services, people waiting years for surgeries and so on. We have emergency room closures and a lack of doctors in rural areas. So people, I think, living in the province of Nova Scotia would be hard-pressed to point to what is improved with the dramatic increase in spending in health care. So clearly it calls for the government to look at new ways to do things. We can't just continue to tread water and do things the way we have before. I mean, this year alone, we have $200 million more being spent in health care. And it doesn't, I don't think it would surprise any of us that this is not sustainable, that the previous Premier of Nova Scotia said it was not sustainable. If it continues to grow like this, we'll be spending all of our money by the year 2020 on health care. And that's just not the direction that we can possibly go. Another concern, Mr. Speaker, in the budget, of course, is the timelines for a lot of these new initiatives. We're looking at anywhere from 4 to 6 to 10 years out in terms of policies. A good example is the continuing care plan, looking at new beds for continuing care, up to 1,300 new beds, but over a 10-year span. And we have fewer health care or long-term care beds today than we did in 1999. We have an aging population. We have increased pressure every year for long-term care, and yet we're willing to wait 10 years to space out 1,300 new long-term care beds. And we know that that's actually the crux of a lot of the problems in healthcare, because that's where the beds are being held in hospitals. And I know probably others among us here met people on the doorstep who were telling us of their relatives spending 4 and 6 months in hospital beds waiting for long-term care beds, and perhaps even more than that. But I certainly had those discussions on the doorstep doorstep with constituents. And this is very hard on everyone. It's difficult in the system, but it's very hard on the families that are trying to do the best for their parents and relatives, and very difficult on the elderly who are in a position that is not the right place to be as an elderly person. You don't belong in a hospital. You belong in a place where there's some social interaction and some different services that would provide some stimulation in their lives. So we know that is one of the key areas of difficulty in the healthcare system, yet we're looking at a 10-year plan to, presumably to solve it, if indeed 1,300 beds would do that. The promise to eliminate the corporate capital tax is not promised until 2012, so a full 6 years away from today, which is, again, just too much time elapsing before we get to that. That's something that would make our province more competitive today. And the corporate sector has been asking for that for a long time. And I, for one, believe that when you help stimulate business, that you do, in fact, generate more jobs, as we said, that will help all of us. So I think that's a very important thing that should be looked at as well in a more timely fashion. Again, daycare is an area that's very important to me, and we're looking at, in this budget, a 10-year daycare plan to add 1,500 spaces. And how many of us have talked to people, again, in our constituencies and in our work as ministers across the assembly here, and realize that people are waiting a year and a half to get infants into a daycare center, that parents are calling us in tears because they can't find those spaces. There's a tremendous need for spaces today, not in that many years down the road. So I think it's really important that we look at these and try to have more immediate needs. I'm really shocked, actually, that the government would put forward a plan that spread over so many years, because the impact is going to be so much more diluted by the time it finally comes. So those are all concerns that we have today. In terms of university students and their future, we're extremely concerned about the high debt load of students and the need for them to leave the province because they have to get higher paying jobs in order to pay back that debt. And it really creates a vicious circle that hurts us economically, because we lose the benefit and the skills of those young people before we've even been able to harness them here in Nova Scotia. And I note that the government has introduced a graduate tax credit, which would begin with this budget, but it's $1,000 which they can benefit by over 3 years. And I think, again, I commend you for looking at this. It was a very big part of the Liberal platform that we put forward, and we felt that we were the only party that really addressed that important need of trying to create incentives for young people to stay here. And I think it is. Yeah. $1,000 over 3 years is just a token, really, and I think we recognize that, and I would hope the government is going to look to expand that. Again, we're not even competing adequately with our nearest neighbor, New Brunswick, in doing this. And the parental contribution limits, which are again being reduced for parents, that's the right way to go, but we're tinkering with this. We should get out of that entirely and allow students to be seen in their own right as individuals and adults. I think it's very important that they be seen as adults who are capable of assuming their debt and paying it back. And there's too many unusual cases where students are denied any kind of student assistance and have to work extra jobs because they either have falling out with their parents, or their parents are unable or unwilling to provide the funds that we think that under the government rules should be provided. So I think there's a tremendous need to adjust that as well. So the measures for the students are very inadequate in this budget. And again, I think it's important in the context to recognize that the May speech from the throne created high expectations among students. The government at that time, through the speech from the throne, said that they would bring the average tuition in Nova Scotia to the Canadian average. And we are right now $2,000 above that national average. And then when the budget was introduced just a few days later, there was no measure to begin that reduction in tuition this year. So I think that the students were rightly very disillusioned and disappointed to see that the government did not act on their stated objective to bring us into line. And again, this plan that is in place is one that it goes over many, many years. There's no reduction in tuition. You're going to try and hold the line till all the other provinces catch up. Well, guess what? They're not all catching up. Some of them are reducing tuition like they have in Newfoundland, and we have to be competitive with that province. So there's a great deal of concern there. Now, Mr. Speaker, gas regulation. This is certainly an area where the Liberal Party differs dramatically from the other two parties in this House. The current gas regulation, which was just introduced on July 1st, is something that we have opposed, and we've opposed it for many, many good reasons. All the clear evidence that has been gathered, including a $170,000 consultant's report, which the government commissioned and which was received last fall, the Gardner-Pinfield report. All of those studies said that we could not affect the price of gas because we're too small a province, and that regulation would only cost us more, that consumers would pay more at the pumps if we actually went ahead with regulation. And yet, despite that advice, the government has done so. And it's somewhat perplexing why any government, any group of people who are entrusted by Nova Scotians to make good decisions on their behalf would not use your judgment and would not follow the advice of the experts and really question this move. And I think that we should be monitoring this very closely with an eye to removing it and removing regulation if in fact we see that the price is just higher at the pumps than it should be, and also that there is no stability. The only possible excuse for doing this is to provide some stability at the pumps. And we're not going to see that under the current plan. You're allowing a 2-week period for readjusting the price, which is very short anyway, and there's a provision to change it if something dramatic happens in the meantime. So really, there's no guarantee for the consumers of this province that they'll even have 2 weeks in periods in which they know what the price of gas is going to be. And I think if you ask Nova Scotians, they would not want to pay more, not even a cent more, to have their gas regulated if that was the cost at the pumps. Right. Yeah, and while we're talking about the cost at the pumps, how are we paying for the regulation of this new regime we're putting in place so that we can control gas prices? Well, we're paying for it by charging consumers. And here in Nova Scotia, the cost is 9/10 of a cent for administration of the program on a litre of gasoline. So we're going to collect over $1 million. I think the cost is about $1.4 million, if I'm not mistaken, to manage this program over an annual basis. And that's being paid for as well by the people of Nova Scotia. And it's interesting at that point to wonder why New Brunswick is able to introduce this with a mere fee of 1/4 of a cent in administration costs when we're going with 9/10 of a cent. However, I will defer to the government about what it costs to actually introduce this. But I think we need to look very carefully as the year unfolds at what the costs are and how it is that we, the people of Nova Scotia, have to pay those extra costs. Mr. Speaker, in terms of the offshore, the government is using offshore revenues to help balance their budget and to fund program spending. And I think there's a note here that has to be cautionary in that. Just in the two months from May 9th when the budget came in to today when it's been revised, we've seen the offshore revenues go down by $8 million. The one revision here was that it was to go from $288 million down to $280 because of revised estimates on offshore royalties. And we're looking at a resource here that is not renewable, and its lifespan is not tremendously long. Export Development Corporation said the value of our offshore exports will decline by 5% next year, just as an example. So we're looking at something that really should be invested for the benefit of Nova Scotians over the long term. And we should be seeing some kind of an investment in infrastructure or legacy that would actually make Nova Scotia more competitive at the time when our gas is no longer flowing or this particular project is no longer there. So it's been wonderful to have this extra money the last few years, and it's increasing very dramatically, but we know it's not going to last for long. And I would very much like to see the government, and on behalf of our caucus, see the government look at something that is an investment that's more permanent so that we could actually tie it to something that would be advancing our cause. Right now, we're not getting anywhere in terms of just putting it into programming that we may not be able to afford in the future. And I think that is the big concern, whether or not this is a sustainable move. Now, Mr. Speaker, our debt continues to grow. It's at $12.4 billion right now. We heard it was about $50,000 per family, $50,000 per family in Nova Scotia. And although our ability to service that debt has been increasing because of our royalties and our own source revenues, that's a positive thing. But while the debt continues to grow, we are not going to be a competitive province. And we do need a plan that's more aggressive in terms of addressing that debt, without a doubt. In terms of the fiscal imbalance, I'd just like to touch on that today because it's been a big part of this speech as well. And I think there's a real parallel to just a few years ago when the government ran their election on the 10% tax cut and had very high expectations and hopes that they would rearrange the agreement with the federal government and have enough money to actually offer that 10% tax cut to all Nova Scotians. Well, Mr. Speaker, we've seen that that didn't occur. In 2004, the tax cut was reversed. It was introduced and then reversed. Right. Back to back, because the good news didn't come from Ottawa. And during that year or year and a half, we heard nothing but blame for Ottawa, nothing but criticism about what Ottawa was doing, in regards to negotiations with Nova Scotia. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, we have to learn to live within our means. As I said in the beginning, we have almost $200 billion more in revenue today than we did 7 years ago. Surely we can plan and live within our means with that and not continually look to Ottawa for blame. I would expect the government to continue to negotiate always and be a partner at the table in the fiscal imbalance negotiations, but not in any way to just look to that as an excuse for not following through on obligations. The obligations the government makes should be based on their own source revenue that they can count on today and not in the future. So, Mr. Speaker, there are a number of areas, as I pointed out, where I have concerns. One of them as well would have to be the troubling size of the cabinet that the Premier has chosen to put in place. 18 members of cabinet when we have a tiny province of less than 1 million people, I think is just a bad signal in terms of governance. And it is not very difficult to say that Canadians are over-governed, and I think that we've just seen an example that Nova Scotians are currently over-governed. I mean, this is really crass, old-style politics to create such a huge cabinet. You think so? I do. Anyway. Mr. Speaker, the concern today is that some of the ministers do not even have full departments. They have only, a few little agencies or areas. Not to say that any one of them are not important, but a single minister could handle several of them. Yes. And the Premier himself knows that he balanced several of those himself when he had the portfolio of tourism and culture, immigration, and health promotions. Not very well, but he did. So it certainly can happen. And I think that we've shown a signal to Nova Scotians that we don't care much about working as efficiently as possible. And I think as well that it's worth noting that the Premier has appointed his former Chief of Staff to a position that pays $130,000 to head up an agency that doesn't even exist yet, that hasn't even been constituted. So, I think that again is a sign of a lack of concern for the spending of the province, and we do need to look at that in some detail as we go forward. Mr. Speaker, I think it's also important that we mention some of the more positive aspects of the more recent speech from the throne and perhaps the government's direction and choices. We are pleased to see that the government has looked at a dedicated department for seniors, and we will watch to see the time frame and the rollout of that. Yeah, that was certainly, again, a major issue for the Liberal platform, and we spoke about it at great length during the election. We believe that seniors, and there are 160,000 seniors in Nova Scotia, we strongly believe that they need a better voice, a more focused voice at the cabinet table. And that would be a huge department. That would be something of great significance. It would also take pressure off the health department to have those issues dealt with in another area. So we strongly support that move. We also believe that the move to create a rural economic development division within the Office of Economic Development is a positive step very much. The rural economy is an essential part of the growth of this province, and our caucus is dedicated to ensuring the viability of our rural communities. And part of that is ensuring that there's positive, sustainable growth. So we need an extra attention on that, and we appreciate the move in that direction. We are also delighted to see the government's willingness to accept the tax credits for graduates as an incentive to stay, although, as I said, it's only the very beginning. We would like to see that extended to some considerable degree. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I would simply like to say that we're committed to working with our colleagues here in the legislature, to examining the budget line by line with the ministers responsible, and to look for value for Nova Scotians in the way we spend their money and how we direct the priorities of this province. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank my colleagues for their attention. Thank you. And I would adjourn debate. Thank you.
Good job,
The estimates are referred to the Committee of the Whole House on Supply. Before we begin with the daily routine, the subject for this evening's late debate has been submitted by the Honourable Member for Halifax Fairview. Therefore, be it resolved that this government work towards a solution to the pollution caused by coal dust, ash, and petcoke in the community of Whitney Pier.
Oh, we got a late debate again, Mark.
Now commence with the daily routine, presenting and reading petitions. The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a petition on behalf of the residents of the Wentworth-Cumberland County area. The prayer reads, "We, the undersigned, petition consolidated in the elementary school." There's approximately 697 names to this petition, which I've introduced or have signed as well. Thank you. Yep.
Presenting reports of committees. Tabling reports, regulations, and other papers. Statements by ministers. Government notices of motion. The Honourable Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Mayan Francis, current Chief Executive Officer for the Human Rights Commission, was recently appointed to the position of Lieutenant Governor of the province of Nova Scotia, and whereas the Whitney Pier Native historic and monumental appointment speaks to her professionalism, dedication to the plight of the marginalized and oppressed individuals and communities, and her role in creating positive change in the community as a whole, and whereas Ms. Francis is a strong role model not only for African Nova Scotian communities but for all Nova Scotians, and as Lieutenant Governor she will represent and serve her community and this province well. Therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in congratulating Mayan Francis in her recent appointment of Lieutenant Governor for Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dalhousie University Political Science Professor Frank Harvey has been awarded the Fulbright Visiting Chair in Canadian Studies at Plattsburgh State University, the first Atlantic Canadian to receive this honour, while in New York State, Dr. Harvey will research issues around homeland security. And whereas Dalhousie University Law Professor Esmeralda Thornhill has won a Fulbright honor and will be a visiting scholar at Temple University in Philadelphia, Dr. Thornhill, the first holder of the university's James R. Johnson Chair in Black Canadian Studies, will lecture and develop teaching materials that promote classroom equality. And whereas Dalhousie University biology professor Bill Friedman earned a gold place recognition and a $5,000 prize at the Canadian Environment Awards in Vancouver in early June for his efforts to preserve Canada's rich yet fragile environment, therefore be it resolved that the members of this House offer their congratulations to Drs. Harvey, Thornhill, and Friedman for winning these prestigious awards and for bringing honor to their university and Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister for African Nova Scotian Affairs.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas years of research, records, and artifacts were destroyed in this past March when the Black Loyalist Heritage Society's offices were set on fire, and whereas the Black Loyalist Society worked very hard to tell their story, which is not only Black history, but Nova Scotia history, and whereas on July 10th, the benefit concert will be held in Halifax featuring local and international choirs to help rebuild what was lost in the fire, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in sending along our best wishes to the Black Loyalist Heritage Society and join me in condemning the senseless act of vandalism. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary minded, nay. Motion is carried. Introductions of bills. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to table a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 217 of the Revised Statutes of 1989, the Income Tax Act.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 217 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Income Tax Act.
Bill number 25, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 217 of the Revised Statutes 1989, the Income Tax Act.
Ordered that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg leave to introduce a bill, an act to enforce a moratorium on strip mines in Cape Breton.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Centre begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Enforce a Moratorium on Strip Mines in Cape Breton.
House Leaders. Bill number 26, entitled An Act to Enforce a Moratorium on Strip Mines in Cape Breton.
Ordered that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. The Honourable Member for Shelburne.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 25 of the Acts of 1996, the Fisheries and Coastal Resource Act.
The Honourable Member for Shelburne begs leave to introduce a bill entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 25 of the Acts of 1996, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act.
Bill number 27, entitled An Act to Amend Chapter 25 of the Acts of 1996, the Fisheries and Coastal Resources Act.
Ordered that this bill be read for a second time on a future day. Notices of motion. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Nova Scotia has played a significant role in the naval affairs of Canada, and whereas Nova Scotia's Irving Shipyard has developed a strong reputation based in large part on the quality and skills of its workforce, and whereas the contract to build the country's new naval supply ships could sustain and help to revitalize the shipbuilding industry in Nova Scotia. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature urge the federal government to favorably consider the bid being put forward by the Irving Shipyard-backed consortium for the construction of the new naval supply ships. And, Mr. Speaker, I would request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers agreed? Agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 65,000 women and children immigrated to Canada during and following the Second World War, with the majority arriving 60 years ago this year, and whereas war brides from across Canada will come to Halifax on August 18th to 20th to a special 60th anniversary reunion, and whereas a Via Rail train will leave Montreal on November 6th and arrive at Pier 21 on November 7th, picking up war brides and their families from various communities in between to join in a two-day celebration of their arrival 60 years ago. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House of Assembly officially recognize 2006 as the year of the war bride. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers agreed? All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 4-H has been helping to develop well-rounded, responsible, and independent youth since 1913, and whereas 8 4-H members of Nova Scotia have been chosen to take part in the 4-H International Exchange Program and travel to Western Canada in July, and whereas Terrence Todd from Avondale, Hants County, was chosen as one of Nova Scotia's participants in the exchange program to travel to Alberta because of exceptional contributions to the 4-H program and to his community. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Terrence Todd and all the participants in the annual Royal Bank of Canada 4-H Interprovincial Exchange Program and wish them happy travels. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
It is me, yes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas school administrators are crucial to the success of our schools and the education of our children. Whereas Tallahassee Community School is an excellent school in which the school principal has been vital to its success. Whereas Doug Pickup is being transferred to a new school after 5 years as principal of Tallahassee Community School. Therefore, be it resolved that this House recognize Doug Pickup for his years of service to Tallahassee Community School and the community of Eastern Passage. And I ask for waiver, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waivers agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Digby and Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on May the 13th, Acadia University inducted Andy Anderson into the prestigious Sports Hall of Fame for being an accomplished athlete in rugby, hockey, baseball, and track and field. And whereas Mr. Anderson graduated from Acadia University in 1933 and went on to medical school at McGill University, where he graduated to become a physician in 1938. And whereas Mr. Anderson later went on to win several service award medals in the Second World War, serving as a distinguished officer in Sicily, Italy, and northwest of Europe, before he tragically passed away in a motor vehicle accident in Germany. Therefore, be it resolved that all members of this House honor the memory of Andy Anderson and congratulate the Anderson family for the recognition of many contributions Andy made to our community and to this province, and to also honor his efforts and sacrifice for our country during his distinguished service as an officer in the Army. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waivers agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas a 114-room Holiday Inn and 500-seat convention center will be built in Stellarton's new industrial park, and it's expected to open for business in September 2007. And whereas the development is an exciting opportunity for Pictou County to enhance its tourism sector and will have many spin-off opportunities, starting with the construction of the facility. And whereas the new convention center will provide opportunities for long-term employment for students from the Pictou campus of the Nova Scotia Community College who graduate from the Business Information Technology, Office Information Technology, and Hospitality programs. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of the House congratulate the town of Stellarton, the McKay Group, and the Bank Group of companies on the deal to build a convention center and the benefits the facility will have on the individuals and businesses in Pictou County. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Request for waivers agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas North-South, a 6-part dramatic series produced by the Halifax Film Company and Inner City Films of Toronto, hits the television screens today, Mr. Speaker, probably in 12 minutes. And whereas North-South is written and produced by Floyd Kane, who hails from East Preston, and whereas this production was shot in and around Halifax with many local actors and an all-Canadian cast and crew. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature extend congratulations and best wishes to everyone associated with the production of North-South, particularly Floyd Kane, its creator and producer. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of motion and passage without debate.
Request for waivers agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Crosby House has served as an absence-based addiction center, helping over 4,000 alcoholics, drug addicts, and problem gamblers, and whereas George Libby led a team of volunteers to raise funds and work with the business community to ensure the center reopened after it was closed in 2003, and whereas in March of this year, Crosby House reopened its doors as a private, non-profit center run by a volunteer board with charitable donations
allowing the centre to offer its services at a much lower rate than similar centres throughout Canada. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate the dedicated volunteer board of Crosby House Society and the volunteers who brought this much-needed centre back to Nova Scotia, and wish them continued success in helping others. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Cumberland North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 4-H members engage in technical skill development, exciting projects, and form long-lasting friendships. Whereas 8 4-H members from Nova Scotia have been chosen to take part in the 4-H Interprovincial Exchange Program and travel to Western Canada in July. And whereas Jessie Dow from Amherst, Cumberland County was chosen as one of Nova Scotia's participants in the exchange program to travel to Manitoba because of her exceptional contribution to the 4-H program and to her community. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate Jessie Dow and all the participants in the annual Royal Bank of Canada 4-H Interprovincial Exchange Program and wish them happy travels. Mr. Speaker, I respectfully request waiver of notice.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the intersection of Walter Havel Drive, Albert J. Walker Drive, and Northwest Arm Drive in Halifax is within provincial jurisdiction. And whereas this intersection has been the site of numerous collisions over the years, more than double the provincial average for similar intersections, and whereas Department of Transportation and Public Works staff have called it perhaps the most dangerous intersection in Western HRM, and have identified safety modifications to the intersection as being a regional priority for the 2006-07 budget year, therefore be it resolved that the Department of Transportation and Public Works should immediately make the necessary safety modifications to the intersection of Walter Havel Drive, Albert J. Walker Drive, and Northwest Arm Drive. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver. I hear a no. The notice is tabled. The honourable member for Glace Bay.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the congregation of Bethel Pentecostal Church in Glace Bay celebrated Canada Day with a special service Sunday, July 2nd, 2006. And whereas Pastor Bob Lothar and his congregation chose to honor members of the Royal Canadian Legion, John Bernard Croak, VC, Branch 3, at this ceremony. And whereas this event was much appreciated by the local community and those in attendance. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate Pastor Bob Lothar and his congregation for the time and effort in organizing this very worthwhile event. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Salmon River, Colchester County, home of DeVille's Rink, is Hockeyville, Canada. Being named, it's only for young people. Being named as our country's most spirited hockey community in the 2006 Kraft CBC Hockeyville Search, and whereas Salmon River bested 49 other Canadian communities to win the Hockeyville Canada title, and whereas DeVille's Rink, which began as an outdoor facility, was built by Father Webster around 1960 for his children and neighborhood kids, added concrete floor in the 1980s, a roof in 1989, and artificial ice in 1997, is home to both ice and ball hockey. Therefore, be resolved that all members of this House congratulate Salmon River, Colchester County for earning the designation as Hockeyville, Canada, and thank Webster and Ellery DeVille and the other members of the DeVille families for their outstanding contribution to Salmon River and surrounding communities. And Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice. Pass.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution.
Whereas Mayanne Francis, originally from Whitney Pier, one of the most ethnic diverse communities in the country, has been appointed Lieutenant Governor of this great province of ours. And whereas Mayanne Francis will become the first black woman to attain this distinguished position. And whereas Mayanne Francis currently holds the position of Executive Officer of the Nova Scotia Human Rights Commission, was the former Nova Scotia Ombudsman and the first female to hold that position. Served as Human Rights Officer in Nova Scotia, was recognized for achievements with the Harry Jerome Award, received an award from the Multicultural Education Council of Nova Scotia, along with being awarded the Golden Jubilee Medal. Therefore, be it resolved that members of the Legislative Assembly congratulate Mayanne Francis on her appointment as Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia and wish her all her best in her new role. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Silent Witness Nova Scotia has been organized to give voice to women who have lost their lives at the hands of their intimate partners. And whereas since 1990, more than 35 Nova Scotian women have been killed and their voices silenced by domestic violence. And whereas Silent Witness is in the process of commemorating the lives of these women through life-size silhouettes, which will stand as a memorial and a call to action to end domestic violence. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House encourage and congratulate the organizing committee as they seek to establish chapters throughout Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas 4-H clubs focus on fun, friends, and learning new skills such as creating crafts, building a website, producing a play, building a small engine, or learning about animals. And whereas 8 4-H members from Nova Scotia has been chosen to take part in the 4-H Interprovincial Exchange Program and travel to Western Canada in July. And whereas Dominique Blaise of Wildville, Lunenburg County, was chosen as one of Nova Scotia's participants in the exchange program to travel to Alberta because of the exceptional contributions to the 4-H program and to her community. Therefore, be it resolved that the members of this House congratulate Dominique Blaise and all the participants in the annual Royal Bank of Canada 4-H Interprovincial Exchange Program and wish them happy travels. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice.
Waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Timberley Prospect.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Candace Slonwhite of Terrence Bay was chosen this year's Female Athlete of the Year at Halifax West High School, whereas Candace Slonwhite has excelled at various sports during her scholastic career, and whereas Candace's dedication and commitment to her schoolwork and sports are exemplary. Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate Candace Slonwhite on her selection as the Female Athlete of the Year at Halifax West High School. I ask for waiver and passage without debate, Mr. Speaker.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Kings West.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the 8th Annual Berwick Sports Hall of Fame induction ceremony was held in June of 2006, and whereas growing up in an athletic community and being blessed with natural abilities, Dan Ware excelled at every sport he played. In recognition of his skills and versatility, Dan has been inducted into Berwick Sports Hall of Fame. And whereas Dan has competed and won at provincial levels in tennis, fastball, as well as hockey, where his 1970 record at West Kings for points per game still stands, his remarkable accomplishments in the variety of sports is to be admired. Therefore, be it resolved that members of this House congratulate Dan Weir on his induction to the Berwick Sports Hall of Fame and wish him continued success. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Victoria, the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I present this resolution, I beg your permission to do an introduction.
Do.
Mr. Speaker, in your gallery are two constituents of Victoria, the Lakes, Brad DeWall and Tom Vickers, and I would ask them to please stand and receive the warm welcome of the House. Mr. Speaker, I present this resolution on behalf of the Honourable Member of Cape Breton North. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future date, I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas on June 30th, 2006, the Bernard Seniors and Pensioners Seniors gathered to celebrate 30 years of service to the community. And whereas Emerson Jessam, president of the club, acknowledged members of the club by presenting them with pins. And whereas the members enjoyed an evening of fellowship, therefore be it resolved that all members of this House join me in sending congratulations to Emerson Jessam and the members of the Bernard Seniors and Pensioners Club. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the community of Spryfield lost its only childcare facility 2 years ago, depriving children, parents, and the local economy of the benefits of locally accessible and affordable childcare. And whereas this government evidently understands the importance of, quote, adequate, predictable, and long-term transfers of funding for any enterprise, yet has done nothing to restore funding for childcare services in Spryfield. And whereas all citizens of Nova Scotia in all parts of the province should have access to quality and affordable childcare, including Spryfield, therefore be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature commit to restoring childcare centre to the citizens of Spryfield as quickly as possible. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. I hear several noes. The notice is tabled. The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I hereby give notice on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas June was Stroke Awareness Month, and whereas Nova Scotia is among the worst rate of death from stroke in Canada, and whereas the Heart and Stroke Society of Nova Scotia has been working hard to teach Nova Scotians to prevent strokes by eating healthy diet, maintaining a healthy body weight, and having an active lifestyle. Therefore be it resolved that the members of the Legislature thank the Heart and Stroke Society staff and volunteers for working hard to reduce the number of strokes in our province and keep Nova Scotians healthy. Mr. Speaker, I request a waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Dr. Sheila Brown has been President and Vice Chancellor of Mount St. Vincent University for the past 10 years, and whereas Dr. Brown has made an indelible mark on MSVU in the areas of community partnerships, student scholarships, and leading-edge education programs throughout the Caribbean, and whereas Dr. Brown is retiring and intends to relax a little before embarking on new challenges and endeavours, therefore be it resolved that members of the House of Assembly congratulate Dr. Sheila Brown on her many outstanding accomplishments and wish her all the best in the future. Mr. Speaker, I ask for waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. The honourable member for Pictou East.
Mr. Speaker, I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas Trenton Works is one of the economic engines of northern Nova Scotia, and whereas Trenton Works is making strong efforts to compete with other Greenbrier plants in the United States and Mexico, and whereas the Pictou County plant has significantly increased productivity in recent months, therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature commend and congratulate the 600 workers currently employed at Trenton Works, along with the management and support staff. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. Honourable member for Halifax Chebucto.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I hereby give notice that on a future day I shall move the adoption of the following resolution. Whereas the Voluntary Planning Heritage Task Force recently released its interim report and recommendations for provincial heritage strategy, and whereas many of the recommendations centre on greater protection of our built heritage, and whereas Nova Scotia has many fine examples of diverse and beautiful architecture that are well worth preserving as an integral part of our shared heritage and culture, Therefore, be it resolved that the Nova Scotia Legislature congratulate the Voluntary Planning Task Force on heritage for the work done so far and encourage all Nova Scotians to take part in the public feedback phase of the process, which concludes on September 1st. Mr. Speaker, I request waiver of notice and passage without debate.
Request for waiver is agreed. All those in favor, please say aye. Contrary, nay. Motion is carried. Orders of the day. Oral questions put by members start at 2:34 and at 3:34. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier.
Hear, hear.
Bay Ferries is the private operator that took over the Digby Ferry in 1997 when the federal Liberal government decided it would no longer run the operation. On Friday, Bay Ferries Limited announced that it plans to end the service between Digby and St. John on October 31st. This move will put 100 Bay Ferries employees out of work, along with at least 30 people who work for associated contractors, all in an area that can ill afford these kinds of job losses. Tourism, of course, plays a large role in the area, and tens of thousands of people used this road as their entry point into Nova Scotia. So my question is this: what is this government doing to ensure that this job-killing plan is halted and that this important service continues?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the Leader of the Opposition raises a very good point. Upon hearing of the news put up by Bay Ferries last week, I immediately contacted Mark McDonald of Bay Ferries and had a discussion on this. Our ministers immediately moved forward to talk to a variety of stakeholders, both within various levels of government, as well with Bay Ferries. And Mr. Speaker, and I can assure the Leader of the Opposition and all members of this House that the government is working on this issue and will do everything we can to see the return of the service.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition, your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, while Bay Ferries will continue to operate out of Yarmouth, the Princess of Acadia is the only ferry in southwest Nova that carries commercial trucks. The loss of this ferry will have a severe effect on companies that carry Christmas trees, ship fish, and live lobster. Without the Digby Ferry, the trip to New England markets will be at least 7 hours longer and much more expensive. Mr. Speaker, this service is vital to the entire southwest Nova economy. So my question for the Premier is, what does the Premier have to say to fishermen, small business owners, and tourism operators about what he is doing to make sure this route continues?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned in my previous answer, Mr. Speaker, I already contacted Bay Ferries myself personally on this issue because we feel very strongly that this is important from an economic perspective, from a tourism perspective, Mr. Speaker, for the transfer of goods for the region. And, the minister that is leading charge in this file is our Minister of Economic Development. And, Mr. Speaker, I have every assurance, Mr. Speaker, that he'll continue to proceed with the file.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition, and your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the shutdown of this ferry is going to hurt rural areas in southwest Nova the most. In last week's throne speech, the Premier alluded to fostering rural economic growth in Nova Scotia, and I can only assume that that would have included southwest Nova. So my question, Mr. Speaker, is if Bay Ferries Limited ends this service, what contingency plans will this government put in place to ensure the economic viability of this region?
Good question.
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, and like the opposition, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to be pessimistic about this file. I'm going to be optimistic about this file, Mr. Speaker. This government will not let the people of southwestern Nova Scotia down, I can assure you that.
The Honourable Member for Digby Annapolis.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transport. Mr. Speaker, last week this province received news of a potential shutdown of the Digby to St. John ferry service. Bay Ferries has stated one of its problems as being roads in western Nova Scotia. The road that comes from the ferry terminal that connects the traffic to the 101 is constantly jammed with local traffic. When the ferry traffic comes in, this road becomes a living nightmare for locals and tourists alike. The alders have grown up so bad on this road. Last year, residents who live along it cut some of them down themselves from embarrassment for the tourists. After the ferry traffic fight through the alders and traffic jams to find the 101 towards Yarmouth, they find that it's not there. The sign says it's there, but it's not there. When the traffic heads up the valley towards Halifax, the tourists find no passing lanes on the 101 between Bridgetown and Kentville. More frustration. No wonder tourist traffic's down. Who in their right mind would come back to a place like that, especially after driving on New Brunswick Road?
Order. Question.
Is the Minister of Transport prepared to look into rebuilding the infrastructure of Western Nova Scotia, making it a welcoming entry point for our national and international visitors?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation and Public Works.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thought for a moment that we had reverted to the address and reply to the speech from the throne, and we're no longer in question period. However, we did hear a question, and Mr. Speaker, I can assure the honourable member that we are committed to improving the roads in this province, not only in the area that concerns him, but all over the province, Mr. Speaker, and we've committed to 2,000 kilometres of pavement, Mr. Speaker, over the coming years, and we're going to get on with that business, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Digby Annapolis on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this question is to the Minister of Tourism. National and international ferry service and roads in Western Nova Scotia are vital for the province's growth in both of its best economic generators, the tourism and fishery. Both of these industries have the potential to double if the proper infrastructure, marketing, and management are put in place. Our fishery can possibly double if we would only look at other countries who have already done this. Tourism could also be doubled if proper transportation connects us to one of our greatest trading partners of the U.S. My question to the Minister: is the Minister of Tourism prepared to look into investing proper access for our tourism industry, and not just in regards to the Digby Ferry, but across our great province?
The Honourable Minister of Tourism, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and rising my first time in the House. I'll try to, I'm not sure that question really should be directed to me, possibly the Minister of Transportation. But from a tourism, culture and heritage perspective, we are very, very proud of the budget that we have and put forth this year. We've had a $2 million increase in it. From a tourism perspective, Mr. Speaker, we have a $600,000 increase in our marketing. And with that $600,000 increase in the marketing, we will move forward to put our best foot forward in Atlantic Canada and the northeastern U.S. markets to ensure that our tourism projections for 2012, which, as everybody knows in this House, calls for a doubling of the tourism revenue in this province for that time, and you will see significant change within the budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Digby Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Premier. This vital link directly employs approximately 130 people in both Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. At its peak, this service carries 190,000 passengers to this province, both national and international. It also carries a huge percentage of Nova Scotia products to vital markets in Upper Canada and the United States. Last year, we seen the Scotia Prince stop its run from Yarmouth to Maine, and it affected everyone in this province. Losing the link between Digby and St. John is certainly going to be another large blow for business, not only for Western Nova Scotia and Halifax, but the whole province. My question to the Premier: will the Premier and his ministers responsible meet with the wardens and mayors from Western Nova Scotia Wednesday following the adjournment of this House?
The Honourable the Premier.
Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Economic Development.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, as you know, I hail from the beautiful Yarmouth area, and that is going to have a definite negative impact on my community. And Mr. Speaker, we are very concerned with the service in the Digby-St. John run, and I can assure the member, as I did on Friday, Mr. Speaker, that there will be meetings, and that member will be involved in the meetings, and the meeting will be on Wednesday after the House gets out.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Premier. You know, Mr. Speaker, on Sunday, Atlantic Superstore opened its doors to retail shoppers shortly after it opened its doors to the police. That's right. Law enforcement officials were sent, tape measures in hand, to ensure that these stores were in compliance with the Retail Uniform Business Closing Day Act. Mr. Speaker, a piece of legislation that these days resembles a moving target. Instead of being out in the communities on patrol, law enforcement officials are now being asked to patrol grocery stores. They are, in effect, being asked to target their limited resources to policing grocers instead of criminals. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Premier is this: will the Premier tell this House why prosecuting grocery retailers is what his government wants to happen?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will say one thing, Mr. Speaker, and the reality is that, Mr. Speaker, there's been many perspectives across Nova Scotia on this entire issue. I myself, Mr. Speaker, I've said it very clearly, I voted in favour of a form of Sunday shopping when the last plebiscite came up. But, Mr. Speaker, the people of Nova Scotia have spoken, and I respect the plebiscite. Perhaps the Leader of the Opposition could say, does he respect the plebiscite?
The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Tell you what I'm going to do, Mr. Speaker. I am going to outline, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to outline for the Premier the process his government seems to be embarking upon. Right. Very likely, whether charges proceed or not, Atlantic Superstore and perhaps other grocery retailers will defy a law which may not be enforceable. If they or others are prosecuted and appeals are pursued, there could be up to 4 courts asked to rule on such a case, taking 6 or more years. The legal bills for the province would be significant, not to mention those for the defendants. Provincial legislation allows for the government to request the Nova Scotia Court of Appeal to rule on a question, and the process is perfectly designed for a situation like this. So I ask the Premier, will your government refer this issue directly to the Court of Appeal, saving the province and our retailers a great deal in potential costs?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I'm going to give the Leader of the Opposition one more chance, Mr. Speaker. The reality is, does he support the plebiscite or not, Mr. Speaker? Leadership comes from example. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, I support the plebiscite. What does he support, Mr. Speaker?
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, leadership comes from actually answering a question every now and then. It's clear, Mr. Speaker, that resources from both provincial government and local police forces are needlessly diverted from other priorities while this course of action is being pursued. And, Mr. Speaker, in the meantime, employees are being forced to work with little or no protection against intimidation or retribution should they choose not to work on Sunday. So my question for the Premier is this: what protection will his government put in place for retail employees who may increasingly be forced to work on Sunday?
Speaker, it's obvious the Leader of the Opposition doesn't want to go near that question, Mr. Speaker. But the reality is, Mr. Speaker, I'll refer this to the Minister responsible for the Act.
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, for the benefit of the Leader of the Opposition, I'm obviously aware of the process that he referred to, and we are obviously looking at everything. But I can assure you, Mr. Speaker, that it's quite a simple situation. We have a law here, that Act, which was approved by the voters of Nova Scotia. The police have received complaints. The police will investigate complaints. The police will make a decision about whether charges should be laid. And if they decide to lay charges, obviously the Public Prosecution Service will go from there. Mr. Speaker, that is the ordinary process, and that's the process that should be pursued.
Queens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
My question is for the Premier. Over 2 years ago, and after significant investment by the local municipal government and ACOA, a new business facility was built in my home community of Liverpool. This helped attract a major new employer to the community. We were pleased to welcome Lightbridge as a good corporate citizen, with well over 150 jobs created for local residents. Recently, the company announced that they will have to close the facility and lay off the employees in August because of the loss of a major contract. The window time is very narrow and employee morale is low. Will the Premier tell this House what steps he will take to ensure that keeping these people employed remains a top priority for Nova Scotia Business Inc. and the Office of Economic Development?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I refer that to the Minister of Economic Development.
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the honourable member. I can assure that honourable member that Nova Scotia Business Inc. is well in tune with this file. And to date, I think there's been a potential of 5 clients go through that facility to look at it, maybe opening up business in that area.
The honourable member for Queens on your first supplementary.
For the dedicated staff at Nova Scotia Business Inc. and other local officials who are working hard to find a new operator, I recognize the challenge posed in seeking a successor company to locate in Liverpool. But I also know, Mr. Speaker, that there are many selling points to recommend our community as a great place to do business. In this case, there are over 150 committed trained workers eager to keep providing for their families. There is also a turnkey facility ready for them to occupy. I'll direct this question again to the Minister of Economic Development. What assurances can he give that a new employer will be found before the August 24th closure of Lightbridge?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sometimes there are challenges in rural Nova Scotia. That's why we announced in our throne speech that we would be looking at rural Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. But also, Mr. Speaker, I can assure the member and all members of the House that my Deputy Minister and my staff and the Nova Scotia Business Inc. is doing their utmost best to find a candidate that will take over the facilities in the Queens area.
The honourable member for Queens on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've had many calls from concerned employees of Lightbridge who want to be assured that their government is taking every possible step to secure a new employer. Staff morale at the facility is getting very low. And since I know the minister personally understands the importance of well-paying jobs in rural communities, I'd like to ask, when can we expect that he will come and meet with employees and local officials to hear their concerns and outline the steps being taken to secure a new employer?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and through you to the honourable member. I can assure that honourable member that I travel that road approximately 2 or 3 times a week. And I can also assure that member that I was in her community on Friday evening last. And that if that member wants to arrange a meeting, that this minister will meet with those employees any day of the week.
The honourable member for Annapolis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Community Services. In the dying days before an election, this government finally announced its vision for daycare in this province. While our province will lose the benefit of $98 million as a result of Prime Minister Stephen Harper's narrow-minded views about childcare, many parents and daycare operators are finally glad to see the province announce something, anything, with respect to a plan on daycare for this province. So my question for the minister is, given that there's huge demands now and a plan has been released, how much of the $20 million offered by the federal government in 05-06, in other words, the last fiscal year, will actually be spent this year helping daycare operators and parents across this province?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for the opportunity to rise in the House and speak on an issue that's important to all Nova Scotians and indeed all Nova Scotian families. The Made in Nova Scotia blended child care plan, which will take place over a 10-year period, Mr. Speaker, puts families first. It's a blended approach that will ensure that we have over 1,000 new spaces created, over 500 new subsidized portable spaces created, and an increase in funding to our family daycare, which especially helps in our rural communities, Mr. Speaker. So I'm extremely pleased to continue with that commitment as laid out by my predecessor, and look forward to unveiling the details of that in the coming days.
The honourable member for Annapolis on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to draw your attention to a request for proposal that appeared on the government website on Friday, June 30th. This RFP is seeking the services of an early childhood development consulting firm, and this RFP has a budget in the amount of $3 to $5 million and a completion date of September 2008. By the time of this project, we will have no daycare workers left. Operational funding is required to provide better wages now, not 2 years from now. Families are waiting for spaces now, not 2 years from now. So my question to the minister is, why did your government announce a plan in May when it would appear from the contents of the RFP that we may not have any movement on these initiatives before September of 2008?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, to my honourable colleague, I appreciate the opportunity to rise and address the $130 million commitment of this government to childcare in Nova Scotia. It's a blended plan, Mr. Speaker. It's meant to be a very complex plan that will include a lot of rural as well as urban issues. And as we move forward with this plan, Mr. Speaker, in the days to come, we'll roll out on the details.
The honourable member for Annapolis on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Surely the government and this department are aware what is needed. More daycare spaces, increased operational grants, wage subsidies, and programs for families living in rural Nova Scotia. The issue has not changed. This government has made daycare promises, but so far fallen short on delivery. So my question is, will this minister outline today what components of the plan that was released in May will see immediate implementation to ensure that the daycare sector in this province is made stronger and not weakened?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And again, to my honourable colleague, I would suggest that after being 1 week in the House on this first session of the 60th General Assembly, a $130 million commitment on the behalf of this government to roll out an increase of 12% in childcare spaces is a phenomenal commitment that all Nova Scotians welcome and support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Late on Friday afternoon over the weekend, it became public that asbestos was found at Joe Howe Manor. We know that there's asbestos in public housing in Sydney, and it was kept secret by this government for months, while construction workers and residents were exposed. Every attempt to get information about the audit that was conducted or maybe conducted has been met with denial and secrecy. In fact, Mr. Speaker, denial and secrecy have characterized this government's response to the question of asbestos in public housing. And its failure to deal with it in a timely and transparent manner is really driving much of the fear and anger behind this issue. My question to the Minister is, when will her department finally conduct an open, transparent, and public audit of the presence of asbestos in all provincially operated housing?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to my honourable colleague, I thank him for the opportunity to rise in the House and speak on this very important issue. It is absolutely the mandate of our department, Mr. Speaker, to ensure the safety of all of our residents. And indeed, upon learning from maritime testing of the issue of asbestos at the Joe Howe Manor, we immediately put into action, Mr. Speaker, the appropriate steps. We identified the problem, we alerted the residents, and we had staff on site all weekend, Mr. Speaker, to answer their questions. And in actual fact, Mr. Speaker, we met with the individuals at noon today to ensure that their concerns were raised, Mr. Speaker. We are doing due diligence, Mr. Speaker, and the residents of the Joe Howe Manor are fully aware, and they are not in danger, Mr. Speaker.
I would just remind all members asking and answering questions to be mindful of language that borders on unparliamentary and could be called into question. The honourable member for Halifax Citadel on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I was at that meeting this afternoon that the minister referred to, and many seniors at the Joe Howe Manor reported breathing problems and issues with air quality. They certainly didn't speak with much great satisfaction with the minister's policy on this issue. We know that the housing authorities have been instructed to look for asbestos and other hazardous materials at this manor. Residents are worried about the quality of information from the housing authority. They want to know how this is being handled, and they want to know if they have been exposed. My question to the minister is, how soon can the residents and workers expect a report back from this minister on this issue?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And as I indicated earlier, Mr. Speaker, the Housing Authority was on site all weekend. The residents were alerted. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, we have instructed the staff to make sure that they do some dust samples as a precaution, Mr. Speaker, to be on the safe side. And when those results come back, we will certainly identify if indeed there are any problems from that point forward, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Halifax Citadel on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, I was at that meeting, and the residents were told that if they put another coat of paint on their walls and in their ceiling, that would address a large part of their problem. And we know that that's the largest part of the minister's strategy on this issue. Mr. Speaker, we know that zonolite, containing one of the most dangerous forms of asbestos, is in at least some of these public housing units, and if disturbed, they can lead to lung disease, including cancer for anyone exposed. Clearly, the minister is not going to conduct an open and transparent audit of asbestos. When can we expect full disclosure of all the findings regarding asbestos in public housing?
Minister of Community Services.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to again rise and assure all members of this House and all Nova Scotians that indeed we have done due diligence. The residents are not in any danger. And Mr. Speaker, I wonder what strategy my honourable colleague is referring to. I don't have a strategy, and if he's aware of a personal strategy that I have, I would offer him to propose that to me, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, for 30 years, I repeat, 30 years, the residents of Western Shelburne County have been waiting for a nursing home to be built. The Department of Health first indicated 12 to 16 beds could be added to Bayside Home, far fewer than the 50 the community needs. Then the Minister of Health wrote the committee and said there would be no nursing home beds in the near future. But during the election, the Premier stopped by to commit 40 bids. My question to the Premier, how many bids will the community get, and when will they be built?
The Honourable the Premier.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, I did visit that facility and had an opportunity to meet the staff and many of the residents. Had an opportunity to see the fine quality of healthcare that is being delivered there, Mr. Speaker. We made a commitment, and I've made a commitment to 40 beds, and as such, Mr. Speaker, they will get 40 beds during the continuing care strategy.
Member for Shelburne on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question again is to the Minister of Health, and I'm going to do my interpretation of Vanna White here. I'd like to table a tender for...
Order. 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 I would also like to remind all members, both new and returning, that the use of props is not permitted in the House, and if you have a document to table, the page will be happy to present it to the clerks. The honourable member for Shelburne, on your question.
I'm quickly learning, but I'm not going to give up on the Bayside project. Mr. Speaker, I tabled the tender for Brass Hill Manor, which dates back 30 years, and I'll repeat, I'm going to say it repeatedly, 30 years. Let's all say it together. 30 years. The residents of Western Shelburne County are tired of broken promises. They are tired of sending their elderly ill away to get care, and they are tired of watching couples who have been married for 50 to 60 years and more torn apart when one or both requires care. My question is to the Minister of Health. What assurances will be given today that this government will finally address the complete lack of nursing home beds in Western Sherburne County?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to maybe dispel some of the myths about Bayside. Bayside, of course, is a facility in Cape Island and Clark's Harbor that basically is a residential care facility, which we'll be transferring, and we're very happy to announce that last week, the transfer of the existing 20 beds or 22 beds that are there today. We are going to be constructing within the first 4 years. The amount of time that it takes to get a tender out, the amount it takes to actually construct things. You know, we all get our hard hats together and get out there and build this home as quickly as possible. So I'm saying that since it's been 30 years that we've been waiting for a home in Bayside, that they will finally have what they deserve.
The Honourable Member for Shelburne on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The municipality of Barrington and the town of Clark's Harbor have offered $280,000 plus land to expand Bayside Home. 3 political parties agreed during the election that the community needs a nursing home. My final question to the Minister of Health is, the local communities are willing to do their part. So when will the Minister put out a tender called for the need for 50-bed expansion for Bayside Home?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I must correct the member opposite that we have committed to a 40-bed expansion to Bayside because that is the amount of beds that that facility can sustain. Plus, we want to be doing some other things within that community, including respite care, including adult daycare, and all the things that are going to help seniors stay in their homes longer. So members, Mr. Speaker, I am committing that as soon as we can get a budget done and we can get the tender documents down, that we will be announcing that as soon as we can.
Of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, on Canada Day, the Conservative government placed regulations on gas prices in Nova Scotia. It has been shown quite clearly that this will not help motorists and in fact will cost Nova Scotians more at the end of the day. Nova Scotians woke up on Saturday to see higher gas prices in our province as a direct result of regulation. My question to the Premier is, when will his government finally focus on lower gas prices for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, the leader of the Liberal Party is correct. We did introduce regulation on July 1st, Mr. Speaker. We are very clear in our intentions was to give stability to Nova Scotians, as well, Mr. Speaker, to provide additional opportunity for small retailers across our province, Mr. Speaker. And I believe that during the election and following, Mr. Speaker, that the people of Nova Scotia have spoken, and the majority of Nova Scotians want to see that stability in place.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier continues to talk about stability and claims that by placing regulations on gas, we are going to have such stability. But let's face it, Mr. Speaker, this does not ensure stability for any long-term period. Gas prices can still fluctuate, and the consumers will continue to be gouged at the pumps. The bottom line is this: gas regulation is going to give consumers higher prices while not allowing for the so-called stability this Premier has promised. So my question to the Premier is, what is your plan when gas regulation fails to provide consumers with the stability and the lower prices that all Nova Scotians are looking for?
The Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the reality is, and we have been very clear on this, the reality is in regulation there will be days where the gas prices will be lower, and there will be other days where it will be higher. But it will be a smoothing out effect, Mr. Speaker, which will provide that stability.
The Honourable Leader of the Liberal Party on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the federal government has recently lowered the GST on July 1st to 6%, but motorists are clearly not seeing this benefit at the pump. We are in a lose-lose situation here, Mr. Speaker, with the people of our province suffering the most. Regulation does nothing to protect consumers from price increases. It just makes certain that gas increases last longer. And my question to the Premier: why are you subjecting the citizens of Nova Scotia to a policy that can only take more money out of their pockets and into the hands of large corporations?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As I said earlier, Mr. Speaker, there are a number things in place when it comes to the regulatory process. It will be handed over to the intention at this point, Mr. Speaker, is to move forward to the UARB later this fall, and they will be conducting appropriate reviews and such. There's also a mechanism in place through the regulations that on a yearly basis it will be reviewed. We want to make sure that this is in the best interest of Nova Scotians, and Mr. Speaker, we feel that that stability and predictability is what Nova Scotians want at the present time.
The honourable member for Waverley, Fall River, Beaverbank.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Health has announced a partnership with Northwood Care to build a 150-bed facility somewhere in the Sackville-Bedford area. The facility site was originally to be located in Rocky Lake, and the announcements go back 4 years. On no fewer than 10 separate occasions, the government committed to building the beds. Now they are delaying building the home even longer by reviewing